ここに繰り広げられる。それがポケモンリーグだ。
This is what competitive Pokemon looked like in 1997, the first tournament series ever. Games were played in the original Pokemon Red and Green in an official format called Nintendo Cup 1997. It had some very interesting rules and some rules that are no longer in place today. These battles, which were Japan only, were even televised on a TV show at the time called 64 Mario Stadium. A lot of the footage has been lost to time, but we do have some remaining videos of those tournaments, and we have written accounts and blogs of what happened and what the metagame was like. We can also compare the metagame to RBYOU, which is the Western counterpart. It's actually interesting. Some Pokemon that are fantastic in Western metagames are pretty average in Nintendo Cup. The opposite is true too. And finally, at the end, we can take a look at what the 1997 champions team looked like, and we can see if it held up or not. The metagame they played was Nintendo Cup 1997, and it was a format where you had to pick 6 Pokemon, but only bring 3 of them to the battle. That may sound familiar to you because that is the current format that Singles uses in-game as well. On top of that, there was an interesting rule where the Pokemon had to have their levels add up to 55, with each Pokemon being between level 50 and level 55. It created an interesting dynamic where you had to choose how to level your Pokemon and how to build your team around these different levels. This is obviously drastically different to Western metagames where you have to use all 6 Pokemon and all of them have to be level 100. Despite both being Generation 1, there are several fundamental differences between Nintendo Cup 1997 and RBYOU. But before we talk about the metagame, the tournament structure deserves talking about too. In particular, it's interesting to talk about how television influenced the metagame. There were 15 in-person regional tournaments that acted as a qualifier for the national tournament, with the champion of each region making it through. But to even make it to the regional, you had to sign up by sending a postcard to a magazine called Koro Koro. Then participants would be selected from a lottery amongst all the people who signed up. Sending in a postcard is a ridiculous sign-up method compared to tournament sign-ups today, but that's just how it worked back then. Interestingly, these qualifier tournaments had segments that were broadcast on a TV show called 64 Mario Stadium. We don't have most of the footage today, however, these segments were instrumental in the development of the metagame. Before Twitch streams and online ladders and Twitter, this was how information spread on a large scale, and watching the TV show was how you kept up with the latest metagame trends. For example, Tauros is now regarded as the king of Generation 1, easily being the best Pokemon. But it first made its mark in 1997 where it swept an entire team on TV, and all of a sudden everyone started to realize how great Tauros was. Some things like Tauros' dominance remains constant even though metagames are different. Here are the several main metagame differences. For one, at a first principles level, metagames are often more offensive when there are less Pokemon in the battle. Because you have less Pokemon able to switch in, you have less defensive resources and offense becomes better. Nintendo Cup 1997 is distinctly more offensive than RBYOU, and this is part of the reason why. Also, in the Japanese versions of Gen 1 Pokemon games, Blizzard has a 30% chance to freeze, not 10%. As you may know, in Gen 1, freeze is effectively a one-hit KO move because you don't naturally thaw out. A 30% chance to freeze on an already strong move is ridiculous, and that dominates the metagame. Ice-type Pokemon cannot get frozen, and that makes them inherently good because they avoid the freeze and have stabbed Blizzard themselves. Jinx, Articuno, and Lapras were top Pokemon because they were Ice-type Pokemon. Jinx in particular was elite because it could both freeze an opponent with Blizzard or put them to sleep with Lovely Kiss. In Gen 1, sleep is almost equivalent to a one-hit KO because it lasts 1 to 7 turns and you can't move on the same turn that you wake up. Articuno was the strongest Ice-type Pokemon and was used a lot, and Lapras, who is average in RBYOU, was great as well. Lapras was one of the few tanky Pokemon who couldn't get frozen. Additionally, unlike modern metagames, evasion strategies and one-hit KO moves were not banned. Double team spam was a very real strategy for several reasons. One is that in Gen 1, evasion modifiers were more powerful than in future games. If a Pokemon used a double team, then an attack's accuracy would be 66% instead of 75%. Evasion was also a strategy to overcome Blizzard spam. Because Blizzard only has 8 PP, you could try to handle it by handling it probabilistically by reducing the odds that it hits you in the first place. And most importantly, Evasion is straight up a good strategy. It makes the game a little degenerate, but it's ultimately likely to lead to good outcomes. One-hit KO moves elevated Pokemon like Dugtrio, who's the fastest fissure Pokemon, and it also led to speed creep wars. One-hit KO moves don't work against faster Pokemon, so it made sense to try and speed creep the mirror matchup. These considerations influence what is a good Pokemon. Meanwhile, Tauros smashes through all of that. Tauros ended up getting the most usage back in the day. At level 55, it becomes your ace Pokemon, and it can run through a team with its sheer power with Body Slam, Hyper Beam, and good coverage moves like Blizzard. It's good for the same reasons it's good in all of Gen 1. It's fast, it's strong, and it has a stab Hyper Beam. If you want to get a little cheesy, you can even use Horn Drill, a one-hit KO move too. Beyond that, many of the Pokemon you expect to be good are still good. Electric types in particular were strong because ground types like Rhydon hate a Blizzard metagame. Strong psychic types like Starmie and Alakazam are good as well, and most Pokemon are about as good as you'd expect. But not all. Some Pokemon couldn't break through. Snorlax and Chansey, who are elite in RBYOU, ranged from average to good in the Nintendo Cup. Why is that? But before we talk about that, we should appreciate what it means to have the best Pokemon. Nowadays, everything is well documented and good Pokemon are easy to find. But back in 1997, physically getting the best Pokemon was a challenge in and of itself. Some Pokemon were difficult to catch, TMs were single use, and you had to be able to link trade to get the Pokemon you need. You only get one TM per playthrough, so to get multiple of the same TM, you would have had to trade for it or had a second copy of the game and trade with yourself. In tournaments, we saw players make practical decisions, like a Lapras who had Strength instead of Body Slam. Body Slam is strictly better than Strength, but it would have cost you a Body Slam TM. Articuno had a practical advantage because it learnt Blizzard via level up and you wouldn't have had to waste the incredibly valuable Blizzard TM. Additionally, DVs and Stat EXP, the equivalent of IVs and EVs today, were not fully understood back then either. You may have figured out that two Pokemon at the same level can have different stats and that trainer Pokemon are stronger than wild Pokemon. But you would have never engineered the exact mechanics, nor would you be creating perfect stat Pokemon. Most people at tournaments did not maximize their stats back then, and that would be unthinkable now. To perform well, you had to actually acquire the best Pokemon too. The champion, who we'll talk about at the end, had a good but not perfect understanding of that. Chansey and Snorlax are typically considered to be top Pokemon in Gen 1, but they're only average in this format. The reason is that they can't keep up in a fast-paced offensive metagame. Their skill set is that they're tanky and pretty tough to knock out, but that has less value here. You're not a tanky Pokemon that can sit down and wall a Pokemon forever. You're a Pokemon that's a sitting duck versus someone fishing for a 30% Blizzard freeze. The chance of getting invalidated by a lucky roll was enough to rein in the tanky archetype. They had some good moments, like when a minimized Chansey defeated 3 Pokemon to win a match on television, but they were overall limited. An interesting practical constraint was that Chansey was a rare Safari Zone Pokemon with a low catch rate too. So even if you were someone who figured out that some Pokemon are stronger than others, you may not practically have been able to find and catch a Chansey that has good stats. Again, these Pokemon are still alright, but you have to be aware of their limitations and their opportunity cost. But no one had a better understanding of the meta than the champion in 1997. It had a lot of the fundamentals for what we consider to be good today. It had 2 Pokemon to Blizzard spam, it had the Lovely Kiss Jinx, it had double team spammers, and it had good type coverage and type synergy. However, one mistake is that his Starmie actually had a 0 DV special attack stat. That's pretty bad for a special attacking Pokemon. But other than that, his Pokemon stats were generally fine. The only weird thing about his team is Kangaskhan, who is now considered to be bad. But on that team, it formed a pretty interesting dynamic as a sort of Tauros light. Kangaskhan, generally speaking, is a worse version of Tauros, but it did have Rock Slide to hit Articuno. It's a good example of team building for a format where you pick 3. Kangaskhan was like a pinch hitter who could sub in for Tauros in the Articuno matchup. That role is not considered valuable today, but it clearly worked at the time. He didn't have a perfect team, but he won the arms race of the generation. It's fascinating to look at the old memories locked in time, so a huge shout out to the people who did document what happened, and I've linked every primary source that I've used in the description below. Thanks for watching, and subscribe if you want to see the deep dive on the 2000 Pokemon World Championship, which actually had its own documentary.